Hi, it's Professor Cohn again. This is the second of the video lectures I'm making for HE242, and this lecture is on Marxist criticism. Before we get started, I want to make sure you make a distinction between Marxist critical thought, and communism or communist thought. We're not talking about communism today. We're not talking about the historical, political system. We're looking at the thought of Karl Marx and the way in which that becomes developed and incorporated into discussions of literature. So if what you wanted was a chance to talk about communism or why you hate communism, this is not the place for it. So when we start talking about Marx, we are talking about a materialist thinker. And when you hear the term materialist, do not think of materialistic in the sense of acquiring or desiring to acquire lots of goods. Materialist thought is actually something I'd be willing to bet many of you actually adhere to. And the idea behind materialist thought is that the world is inherently made up of matter. There is no world beyond this world. So we can contrast materialist thought with idealist thought. And again, we're not talking about idealism in the sense of having high goals or having high hopes or being optimistic. The idea is that for Marx, a materialist view offers scientific, concrete, logical explanations of the world. Idealist thought offers an explanation that is not scientific, that is not provable. So religion, of course, is an idealistic form of thought. So with Marx, the idea is that the world, the physical world, shapes consciousness. It shapes who we are. It's not the other way around. Our consciousness does not shape the world. We are shaped by the world. And the idea then that emerges from that is that in terms of explaining reality, for Marx, you have what he calls the economic base. And again, when we use economics, don't just think business, think all interactions between people, all exchanges, and material exchanges. And so what we're looking at then is an economic base upon which is built a superstructure of culture, law, politics, all the things that we consider to be sort of abstract, but of value. That's all based on our economics. And when we get into Marx, and we can acknowledge Marx's political goals, right? Marx wanted a classless society that was based on common ownership of production, distribution, and exchange of goods. Right? So that's sort of the political ideal underlying this. But many of the terms, many of the ideas that Marx is presenting to us become really useful. So we have to make sure we're good on the terms. One of the key terms that comes up when we are dealing with Marxist thought is capital. And Parker defines that as money that makes money, which is a pretty good definition. Another way of thinking of it is just the means of production. In a capitalist society, you have two groups. You have the bourgeoisie, who are the merchant class or the managerial class, and you have the proletariat, who are the working class. And for Marx, human history can be understood as a conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It's a class conflict. There are other ways of describing human history, right? We could talk about it as the progress of rational ideas, or we could talk about it as successions of dynasties, for instance. Those would be different ways of talking about what human history is. For Marx, it's a class struggle. That struggle he describes in a term that's often brought up called the dialectic, and it's an idea that comes from the German thinker Hegel. And we'll do it in class, but it's a sort of simple, almost triangular movement. You have an idea, a position, a state of affairs, and that's called the thesis. And then its contrary, which is called the antithesis, engages with it, interacts, collides, whatever you want to say. Out of that engagement emerges a synthesis of the two. But of course, history keeps moving, so that synthesis becomes the next thesis. Again, we'll talk about that more in class, but I just want to make sure we get a quick outline of some of the key terms in Marxist critical thought as Parker is presenting them. So One thing that we also can note about Marx is that he's really thinking about human life after the Industrial Revolution, right? Once we have industrialized our economies. And Marx describes the way that labor changes in an industrial economy, and many of the key ideas that we're going to be dealing with in Marxist thought emerge from this idea of a change in the way that labor is practiced and the way we experience labor. So I want to start with a stupid example, but it may be helpful. Let's imagine a guy, we're going to call him Joe the Cobbler, right? And he's a cobbler, so he makes shoes and boots. So before industrialized labor, Joe would make shoes, leather shoes, and he'd make them for himself and he'd make them for others. A few things about the nature of Joe's work, right? It's handiwork. He does it himself. Maybe he has some helpers in his shop. Maybe it's a family member, but he knows them. They're close by, and he's working with them. He knows that these shoes will be worn. He knows what they'll be worn for the most part. He knows probably who will be wearing them. He's probably only selling more or less locally. And he'll probably also be able to recognize his own work, right? He can make the shoes in exactly the way that he wants to. And perhaps actually he may have a few people who come just because they like the way Joe the cobbler makes his shoes. Maybe they just happen to have no other cobblers in the area. But this is sort of pre-industrial Joe the cobbler. But once we industrialize Joe the cobbler's labor, certain things change. So with Joe the cobbler's labor in the earlier pre-industrial system, we could say that the value of the shoes is a use value, right? They are valuable because of what you can do with them. But when you industrialize labor, you shift value, and value becomes exchange. And so let's sort of walk through Joe's experience as an industrialized cobbler. So his work is now mass-produced, right? He's not the only one. He's not going to be making the shoe from start to finish. It's going to be maybe some sort of assembly line. He'll only be doing parts of it. It's also not going to be individualized, right? We don't let individual shoe artists do their work in a Nike factory, right? All the shoes are meant to be standardized. That is there's a predetermined value that the shoes have to sort of meet, and you have to fulfill your job of making the shoes that way. You can't really individualize them. So that kind of labor has been lost. The shoes are going to be shipped and distributed really widely. So you're not necessarily going to know the people who are wearing the shoes. And the shoes are going to be bought and sold. So one of the things that we might notice is that Joe the cobbler could have bartered with his shoes. He could have exchanged them for other things. And he may have sold them for money. But again, the shoes would have a use that he would know. And with his money, he would be spending it on other objects that other local artisans had made. And those items that he purchased would be of use. All right, they'd be purchased for the sake of using them. Now, whether or not this society has ever existed, treat it as a thought experiment, right? So the idea is that pre-industrial society, pre-industrial economic systems work on a kind of artisan basis. Post-industrial, the worker's relationship to the work has changed radically. And the term that Marx is going to use for that is alienation. The root of that word, alien, means stranger. And the idea is that you have been estranged from your work. So Joe the cobbler earlier made these shoes by hand. He probably knew the guy who brought him the leather. He knows who he's selling them to. He probably sees them on the street. He can recognize his work. He's very closely connected with his labor and with the product of his labor. Joe the cobbler post-industrial, so here we can imagine Joe in a Nike factory perhaps, he is not connected with his work in any really meaningful way. And the work that he produces, the whole point of it is that it can be sold for something, that it can be exchanged for something. And that idea that you can buy and sell something the term that gets used for an item that can be bought and sold is a commodity. So in a capitalist society, value shifts from the use of the object to what it can be exchanged for. And so, shoes are valuable. It actually only costs, so many dollars to make a pair of shoes, but you can sell them for a lot more, so their value is much higher. That's the exchange value of the shoe. And then the other thing we might notice is the shoes themselves may be useful, like you wear them on your feet, but they also may start to acquire what is called a sign exchange value. And again, back with Nikes, you may have a really high-end pair of Air Jordans. I don't know what the shoes are called these days, that have a kind of status to them. And you probably actually wouldn't wear them to play basketball. You wouldn't wear them out when you were gardening. You wouldn't wear them as functional shoes. You would wear them because they were expensive shoes. They were showy. They had a kind of artistry to them. Of course, it's not an individualized artistry. It's just a design that Nike has decided is the pattern they want. But that would actually have value to you, not just because it could be sold, but also because it brought you a kind of status, a kind of visible rank within society. So, with that alienation from his labor, what we start to notice is that the work that Joe does produces commodities, objects that can be bought and sold. And they become things, and they're things that you're disconnected from. And this sense of thingification, that's the term that Parker uses, the technical term is reification. The idea is that in a really highly commodified society where you're buying and selling goods, and their value is not in their use, it's in what they can be exchanged for, then you start to commodify everything. And once you start moving towards treating people as commodities, you reify them. We talk about sometimes, for instance, when you're talking with economic models, you might talk about the labor force. That's an instance of reification, right? Because we're now treating individual human laborers as interchangeable parts. And pay attention to that metaphor there, right? It's the part of a machine. And if it's a machine and it's a machine part, it can be replaced by an identical part. So you as a worker are now no longer individual. You are simply a worker. All right, you can easily be replaced. You'll notice that this reification really shows up in the metaphors that are embedded in our language. So, for instance, we might talk about building business connections. And the idea of a business connection, right, that's a relationship between individuals. But notice how we're treating it as a thing. You build it, and it has value for you because you can make money off of it. Even though this is a relationship between two people, it's actually now become a commodity, a money-making good. We can also talk about influencers today. Go online, try out some of the just online handy definitions of influencer, and these are people who hold sway over a commercial audience, right? The whole point of their influence is not that they are relating to people and then generating important ideas necessarily. They are important people who can affect a commercial audience. And so again, this constant commodification of human society, that's one of the things that Marx is looking at, he's interested in, he's concerned about. So in early Marxist thought, you get a lot of what's called economic determinism. You may recognize the determinism term from the earlier lecture on feminist thought where we talked about technological determinism. In Laura Mulvey's essay, the idea that the film itself kind of creates a voyeuristic, sort of male-centered kind of cinema. And you'll sometimes see early Marxist thought discussed as a kind of economic determinism. The idea is that these economic conditions are invariably going to lead to certain aspects of culture working a certain way. And I think that later Marxists and Marxist critical thought wants to get away from that kind of determinism. It's a little too confining, too constraining. Given the impacts that Marxist thought describes on an industrialized capitalist society. A number of thinkers have asked questions about why, if these are if alienation from your work, a kind of reification, you actually stop seeing yourself as a person, you start seeing people as objects, relationships as commodities, etc. Given these impacts on society, a question arises: why is it that the proletariat has not spontaneously revolted against these conditions? Because they are conditions that are they're dehumanizing. They're harmful in certain ways. And later Marxist thinkers asked that question, like, why don't we see spontaneous revolutions of workers rising up against capitalist bourgeoisie and taking control of the capital? One of the thinkers Parker writes about, and I think he writes pretty cogently about, is Antonio Gramsci, Italian thinker. And Gramsci proposes that the right, and so you'll notice that he's associating far right thought with the capitalist merchants, that they maintain their power over the broader proletariat, not through the state's coercive means, right? Not through the military, not through the police, because that would be one way to maintain control of the proletariat, but Gramsci doesn't see that as the force that controls them. The far-right thought has hegemony or cultural influence over the proletariat. That's actually how you actually keep that group controlled, because they internalize through culture the policies that support the capitalist system. Here's a quick example, right? This is, and please take it as a just a passing example. It's not necessarily a highly detailed one, but it's probably not an uncommon one. Let's talk about tax rates in the United States, right? So something that might be pointed out is that the proletariat, right, the workers, they directly benefit from government social programs that are funded by tax dollars. The bulk of those tax dollars are collected from higher income tax brackets. However, and this is a Gramscian explanation of things, the hegemony of the right, the cultural influence of the right, leads the people, the proletariat, who would benefit from taxing higher incomes, to fight against such taxation, presumably with an eye to protecting their own future incomes and fortunes, even though they are statistically unlikely ever to earn the kind of income that would place them in those higher tax brackets, right? So there's this sense in which these individuals have sort of been conditioned to believe in, to have a set of values that actually work against them. There will be a later term, false consciousness, that we might associate with this. So Parker himself provides a rather lengthy and really disheartening example of this when he gets into ideology. So I'm going to make a quick move here from Gramsci to a later thinker, Louis Althusser. So remember that Gramsci's got the idea: you've got state coercion, and then you've got hegemony. And the hegemony is that cultural influence that gets people to accept values that actually don't support them economically. With Althusser introduces a term, ideology, and this is a very slippery term. I want to make sure you understand. Ideology here does not mean a set of political beliefs and values that are consciously chosen. That is not it at all. The definition that Althusser gives us of ideology is the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. And I'll say it one more time. The imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. When you hear the term imaginary, don't think imaginative, think Lacan, and think of Lacan's imaginary, that infant state, 0 to 6 months, when the infant feels undifferentiated from the rest of the world, and feels as if, when it calls out, the mother comes and nourishes it or takes care of it, cleans it, whatever. but that's a mischaracterization of itself. That's a misrepresentation of its relation with the world. The child might think that the mother is a kind of extension, but that's not accurate. And that misrepresentation, that mischaracterization, is something that Althusser is very interested in ideology. So it's a set of values, and typically unconsciously absorbed ones, for explaining the world that actually do not line up with the real experience of individuals. Parker gives the example that I mentioned earlier, and I did think it was really disheartening, and he writes about the purpose of college education and why students might go to college. And he runs through a list of things, and these are things like personal growth, education, self-discovery, and we might look at those and say those are all ideas, and they are all really pretty positive, hopeful things. And then he makes a turn and he says, actually, the great majority of students who go to college, whether or not they know this, aren't going to college for self-discovery and knowledge. They're going to become middle managers. And statistically, that's where most of them will be in terms of their professional lives. They will be occupying a role of middle management. And they will actually be continuing the proliferation of a system that uses those kinds of middle managers. So here we see an ideology that misrepresents the actual conditions of existence. Now, I will let you know that Parker gives you several outs, and he doesn't think that people are doing this cynically. He's just pointing out that this seems to be where we're going with college education. The example I'd give you as midshipman is from a publication that the admissions office actually came up with several years ago. They commissioned a graphic, it was a graphic novel, although it's so short you just call it a comic book, called Bravo Zulu. And I will post the PDF of this on Blackboard. It's fantastic reading, not because it's good, but because it really provokes some interesting thought. And I'm going to have to, it's been a while since I've looked really closely at it, but I want to read my notes about it. So in it, you follow a group of 5 plebes, and one night they are down in John Paul Jones' crypt, and they're thinking about their Naval Academy experience, and they meet the ghost of John Paul Jones during Crypt Watch. And he comes and gives them their futures, gives them a glimpse of the future that they're going to live if they continue with their education at the academy. And I want to run through what the 5 plebes do. So one of them will be valedictorian. One of them will graduate first in his class, and then we see him later doing something very heroic while serving aboard the USS Reagan. One will be the best pilot in the fleet. One will be an astronaut and become a UN diplomat. One will become a SEAL who eventually saves that astronaut diplomat when she's kidnapped by terrorists. One will go MedCorps, become a Navy doctor, and eventually become the personal physician of the President of the United States. It's very important to recognize that it was the USNA admissions department or program office, that produced this, right? Because what they're doing is they are interpolating. That's another Althusserian term. They are interpolating readers of this graphic novel to be drawn into dominant social assumptions, right? And the dominant social assumptions are midshipmen are exceptional, the Naval Academy education is exceptional, and midshipmen will all graduate as exceptional individuals. I teach at the Naval Academy. I think we deliver an exceptional education. But you'll notice that these assumptions probably have a lot of places where you can poke some holes in them. At the very least, we know that statistically, a very, very small number of midshipmen are going to go MedCorps. A very small number are going to go Special Forces. And it's rather remarkable that you have an astronaut, the valedictorian, and the future best pilot in the fleet all teamed together with this future doctor and this future SEAL. And one of the things to notice here is that if you read this unselfconsciously, if you read this graphic novel without really thinking about what's going on, you're likely to buy into a system of thought that says the Naval Academy produces exceptional individuals. But in fact, the great majority of midshipmen are going to go on for professional lives that are effectively what Parker is calling middle management. That does not denigrate the value of them. I hope you understand that I'm not arguing that point. But I am trying to point out how there's a set of implicit assumptions that you are absorbing and you're being called to passively absorb. And one of the things that Marxist critical thought is really good at is getting us to become self-conscious about these things, to notice these structures that govern our day-to-day lives. Now, of course, if you go back to Marx's early writings, you can see that there's a kind of revolutionary appeal here, right? That there is a goal of achieving a kind of classless society. There is a goal of overturning these hegemonic structures. But at the very least, for our own sake, noticing that these hegemonic structures are in place, that they're invisible, that we think they're natural, but in fact, they don't actually have a basis in nature per se. It's just that they shape our lives. These are things that Marxist critical thought gets us to pay attention to. This is running a little long, so let me give you a couple of last thoughts on Marxist criticism. I mentioned before that later Marxist thinkers find economic determinism, the economic determinism of early Marxist thought, restrictive. And so they start looking at the superstructure, and remember that's the cultural overlay, right? And that includes not just aesthetics, but also law, politics, etc. And they make the argument that there is greater freedom or autonomy of the superstructure from the base, that economic conditions are not the sole determinant of the superstructure. The superstructure actually has some limited autonomy. Parker goes to great lengths to make sure that we understand that this does not mean that there is the possibility of being completely free from economic conditions. That's not the case at all. And so it's an entirely relative autonomy. You never actually get away from economic conditions, but you do have room to explore them and to challenge them. So moving into that, I want to talk about two terms that Parker introduces toward the end of the chapter. One of them is the idea of the alienation effect, and what I'm trying to do right now is move from Marxist thought into the ways in which we can apply it when we do literary criticism. So he takes a look at the German playwright Bertolt Brecht, and Bertolt Brecht has a theory of acting and of theater that calls for an alienation of the audience. Think about a traditional theater. You go, you sit in an auditorium, the house lights are dimmed, and you watch on stage, and the stage is a kind of barrier, a fourth wall, as it were, between you and the people on stage. And what you are seeing on stage is real life. Now, it might be in a different setting or a different time, but the idea is that what you're witnessing is you're meant to believe that the people you're seeing up there on the stage are real within the parameters of their world. Television works exactly this way, right? That the TV itself is a fourth wall. It's a barrier between you and the reality that you're watching there. Yes, we know that in Game of Thrones, we know dragons aren't real, but in the world of Game of Thrones, dragons are real. So we go along with that. In Brecht's notion of theater, and it's one that a lot of later writers pick up, you try to make the conditions of the theater that were unconscious before, you try to make people conscious and aware of them. So for instance, you turn the house lights up and you keep the house lights up. So you no longer get that freedom to sit back as an audience member and just voyeuristically observe what's going on. You can now be seen very clearly by the actors on stage, and that changes the way you relate to them. The actors themselves may go past the fourth wall. They may walk out into the theater. They may talk to you. They may ask you questions. The actors themselves, the characters that they're playing, may stop being characters for a moment, and they actually may start asking questions about why the writer wrote their role this way, and they're doing all of this on stage. And you'll notice that what Brecht is doing is he's taking that idea of alienation, which earlier we were talking about what happens to laborers and how they get alienated from their labor. What Brecht is doing is he's making things strange to us. He's making us aware of all these unconscious assumptions we have about theater, and he's discomforting us. He's making us ask really critical questions about what it means to be an audience member. Who gets to be an audience member? How much did it cost you? Are you privileged because you got to go? And we can talk about specific examples of this, especially in theater, but in other areas of literature. But that's an instance of Marxist critical thought taking an earlier Marxist term and seeing how it might work within an aesthetic setting. The other term that I want to turn to is one that comes to us from Pierre Bourdieu, and this is the idea of cultural capital. So Bourdieu asserts that aesthetics, right, just the realm of art, which we like to presume is separate from the world of economics, right? The idea would be that, anybody can go and look at a beautiful painting, anybody can read a poem, and maybe poetry exists in a world that is away from, these dingy affairs of money and commerce. And what he actually argues is that the realm of aesthetics is actually very much an economic realm, and it's a realm where aesthetics is related to class position. The idea here is that the working class, the proletariat, has certain aesthetic tastes. There are certain values and certain kinds of art that the working class tends towards. And he sort of explores this and notes that the working class tends to favor realism. They tend to favor functional painting, realistic painting, portraiture, for instance. And they also like photography, right? These are things that fall within the proletariat. Whereas the bourgeoisie, the upper class, the elite, they favor avant-garde literature, so writings that maybe don't follow traditional narrative patterns or that have characters who don't line up with any of the traditional types that we might have, writing that features stylistic elements that are disruptive, that break the illusion that when we read we're falling into a story. They favor abstract painting. They favor art photography that maybe isn't realistic or that tries not to be just a representation of the image that it's depicting. These particular tastes are tied to levels of education, wealth, and leisure. And according to Bourdieu, they are a kind of capital. That is, they are a means of producing value, right? So those elite tastes are a kind of capital. They're a cultural capital, and they typically stay within the upper class. If you can acquire these tastes, that may be a way of moving into the upper class, but these tastes also reproduce and legitimate the social hierarchy, right? So only people of a certain wealth and distinct education status are perceived as being capable of appreciating these things. So there's a way in which we're getting that class conflict that is at the heart of a Marxist description of history, and Bourdieu is finding it working in a realm, aesthetics, that might typically be seen as removed from historical and economic conditions. There is a lot more in this chapter, and I spent hours preparing notes for this lecture, and it's a tricky subject because it may, for some of you, really kind of hit some political or economic values that you have. And if that's the case, that's fine. I am not up here championing any of these positions. I'm trying to represent Parker's ideas and trying to get you used to some of the basic critical terminology that we're going to be dealing with in all future elective courses. But one of the things that I might urge you to do is, if as you're reading, if you feel like you're formulating lots of objections, if you sort of are getting angry with the ideas, whatever, if you yourself discover you don't want to have a materialist philosophy or a materialist explanation of the world, try playing what Peter Elbow calls the believing game, right? Elbow points out that we are trained as Westerners when we hear arguments always, always, always to look for the weak links in the arguments and to attack them, to hammer them, to look for contradictions, to look for instances where there's inadequate evidence. And that skeptical, doubting position is what we're trained always to do towards other people. Elbow points out, we never direct that kind of criticism against ourselves. We never take our own positions and question them that way. We always believe our positions. And what Elbow urges us to do when we encounter systems of thought or arguments that we disagree with is to play the believing game. And what he means by that is to question and be skeptical of our own assumptions, of our own values, and to try believing the opponent's position, to try believing the other side of the argument. Believing does not mean signing a contract that you will agree and abide by something. Believing simply means that you are going to try to understand the other person's argument in their terms adequately to their satisfaction, right? And so as you're reading along, try to formulate these Marxist thoughts, these ideas, these questions that are being presented here, and ask yourself, would Parker, would Althusser, would Gramsci, would Marx himself, if I presented the argument back to that person, would they be willing to respond by saying, yes, you have it right? Because if you could get that kind of response, Elbow would say, you're playing the believing game. You're trying to understand their arguments in their own terms. And once you do that, you may find yourself less defensive, less reactive, more open to some of the subtleties, some of the more interesting subjects, and less preoccupied with finding ways to defend your own core assumptions, which really isn't going to be a terribly productive kind of thought work for you at this stage. At this stage, the best thing for you to do is to try to make sense of Marxism, Marxist critical thought, in its own terms. Okay, thanks for your time. I'll see you in class.